I very much enjoyed the summary paper which you produced, Ernesto. I think it was very useful in terms of providing a framework for contrasting the different experiences of the 4 countries that you are looking at in detail. From a UK or an English perspective, the part of the summary document which I thought was most useful was the figure 1, which I think appears on page 3 of the document, where you distinguish between direct and indirect urban policies and urban strategies, and you look at explicit versus implicit effects. So the presentation I want to make it fits within within that scheme that you outlined. And what I will argue, I think, is that whereas the UK and England more particularly has been famous for what appears in the top left-hand side of that box, that is to say, we have much experience with direct, explicit urban policies and programs. The changes which we've begun to see in recent years in England have been away from that approach. Now, in principle, what UK governments have argued is that the movement of urban policy has been towards the bottom right box in your figure. So we are moving towards a less direct and more implicit approach. So the principal changes that we've seen have been towards the decentralization of responsibility for urban policy and urban strategy. I take a slightly different line than the UK government in trying to understand the changes which we've seen in recent years. My argument would be that we are moving away from direct, explicit urban policy to direct, implicit urban policy. And let me try and describe why I think there is a difference between my interpretation and what the UK government says it is trying to achieve. We had until very recently in the UK an unbroken period of consistent economic growth, which lasted from the early 90s until the middle of last year. That provided a market-driven renaissance of many of the UK's principal cities, which we hadn't experienced since the 1960s. We certainly don't have on record any 15-year period like the one we recently went through. What that meant, in effect, was that many of the urban policies and programs which had been designed in the early 1980s and through the 1990s, responding to a less positive economic set of circumstances, started to be revisited. We were less worried, effectively, about the economic future of our major cities, and we began to think about cities in terms of their potential, and particularly their potential in contributing to the national economy, rather than about their problems, which is what all the previous regimes of urban policy had tended to focus on. In that context, what we were grappling with in our major cities was as much the challenges which economic growth generated as the challenges which still persisted about worklessness, about social cohesion, about crime, about housing, all the things you would expect in some of the more run-down areas of our cities. But the general tone of urban policy was redirected towards looking at the issues of growth. What I would argue is that the sorts of things which happened from early this century had more of a focus on problems of managing growth in the one area of the country where those issues were most acute. So a lot of attention was focused on the capital city of London and of the city region which surrounds London. And many of the initiatives which you listed in your report, the Sustainable Communities programme, for example, primarily, I would argue, tried to think about the implications of growth which is led from London and the southeast of the country, and developed a range of responses to that. What we therefore had was a set of urban policies and programmes of a traditional kind which began to be squeezed, so there was less money going into those programmes, and a whole set of mainstream policies in the areas of, for example, transport, in terms of housing, in terms of land use, which was focused around the issues of growth of London and its surrounding super-region. Of course, no government would admit to favouring one area of the country over another. But I think if you looked at the way in which public expenditure began to shift in that period from early this century. So I think the major shift in urban policy has been away from direct, explicit urban programmes to direct and implicit attempts to try and manage the national economy in a different sort of way. What the government is trying to achieve at the moment is the decentralisation of responsibility for urban policies and programmes to the subnational level. And we have a very complicated set of relationships at the subnational level. So we have regional organisations which are not directly elected, the regional development agencies. We have regional offices of government, and we have ways of bringing together the local authorities on a voluntary basis at the regional scale. Our regions are quite big. We have 9 regions with populations of between 3 and 8 million people in them.